Welcome to the Family Financial Conversation, an Advisorpedia-powered podcast about the decisions families make as they age that involve money, but might revolve around very different things. Listen in for thoughts from industry experts on getting the best possible outcomes from those decisions through the lens of great financial advice. We are all entering this age of longevity together. Let's begin.
Welcome, everybody, to the Family Financial Conversation. I'm your host, Tom West, with my co-host, Suzanne Schmitt. Suzanne, good morning. How are you doing this morning?
Good morning. I am doing very well, and I hope likewise.
I'm so far so good. I am particularly excited about our topic today, which is really zeroing on advisors focusing on the rapid change that we're seeing in our clients' demographics and the increasing need to focus on successor decision makers in all forms, everything from trusted contact to successor trustees to folks with healthcare directives and whatnot. And we know with the shifting in assets with different generations, but also the shifting in decision-making roles with changes in ability as clients are going through different aging and cognitive issues. This landscape is, I think, forever changing the institutional approach that advisors need to be aware of. So as a place to start in the world of successor decision-making, Suzanne, set the stage. What's the institutional environment that has changed for financial advisors in ways they understand this new relationship with the new decision makers that might be coming?
Yeah, it's a great question and a great jumping off point. And I think from the institutional perspective, there are a few things that are top of mind. First and foremost, you touched on demographics. The vast majority of assets at all firms are now held by people who are very apt to be cognitively impaired and are moving closer towards points in their life where they are going to need support in the healthcare realm, in the housing realm, and likely in the psychosocial realm. So said another way, institutions are keenly aware that their books are aging. And rather than seeing the aging of the book as an obligation, if you would, more institutions are thinking about constructive ways that they can coach up and support their advisors in connecting not just with clients, but starting to build out those second and third tier relationships with the second generation and the third generation. So it's early days relative to how institutions are thinking about things. And definitely institutions skew towards the more proactive front versus the reactive front. But all in, this is a demographic wave that is forcing institutions and advisors to frankly think a little bit differently about the handoffs, if you would, between the generations.
Sure. So audience, remember, I'm an advisor and a practitioner first. And when Suzanne and I were brainstorming about what to talk about, first thing that I had to do is think about, well, what is all the stuff that my custodians and my institutions are forcing me to do? Like the necessary, not sufficient thing. Like I got to fill out these trusted contact forms. More and more custodians are requiring me to have successor decision makers like on institutional paperwork just to be able to maintain the relationship. And Suzanne, my sense with all of this stuff is this is a way for me as the advisor to cover my own rear from a liability standpoint and the institutions to sort of cover their rear end as well. But that's really more about taking care of the institutions and not necessarily taking care of the client. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll start with FINRA 4512 trusted contact that you raised. It's a combination, as you said, of making sure there's I'll call it a safety net in place, a slightly different take on your cover the derriere. But the notion is to have that safety net in place to care for the institution, to care for the advisor, and ultimately to care for the client. Now, on the plus side, doing that really does open up the opportunity to talk a little bit more expansively and constructively around what it means to age in place across the generations. And again, done well. And we're seeing more and more institutions looking into, I'll say, support services, bringing those into the conversation can, if done well, help an advisor not be the bad guy by raising an issue for which there is no good solve.
Yeah. And let's remember sort of the state of nature with all of our statistics, with the overwhelming percentage of advisors that get fired at the death or disability of a first spouse, and even more of them that are not retained at the death of the second spouse. So in speaking with other advisors, this seems to be sort of the default reality where an incoming call comes in. Listen, this is, John Smith. You're the financial advisor for my dad. I need to check on my successor trustee or power of attorney and whatnot. And in the advisor's mind, a lot of times, this is the beginning of the end of the assets sort of going out the door. If those statistics are holding true, there's a bit of sort of a fatalistic view of this primary client relationship is no more. And I've got all of these new family members that are entering into the dialogue that I have with this client, this revenue stream, this part of my assets under management. And I'm kind of ready for this to go out the door. I don't know these people. I'm not exactly sure what their motivations are. And if I'm not making like an immediate rapport trust build with this first impression sort of in the moment, I'm kind of kicking pebbles, and I kind of know this is probably going to be leaving. And I move sometimes very quickly to like, what is the least administrative and operational role that I can delegate out so I don't have to like endure the hangnail conversations of watching this relationship sort of leave over time. What I don't want to do as sort of a human being is be that advisor that's kind of scrambling for G2 conservation. Like at the point, that's not what the person on the other end of the phone wants to talk about at all. Like, I don't want to be that creepy advisor that's a little bit too grabby now that this revenue stream is sort of at risk in my practice. So I don't know. I mean, I'm sympathetic with advisors that feel like all of a sudden they're bystanders. They don't have value to add in the moment right now, particularly with these new roles and responsibilities. That seems to be sort of a baseline profile of a lot of the advisors' experience at the front end of these successor decision-making conversations. Tell me a little bit about what you think institutions know and need to know about advisors' challenges in those conversations.
I think that institutions to date have really focused on putting the burden of proof, so to speak, on the advisor. Assumptions have been made, I'll go back to how trusted contact was rolled out across most major institutions, that there would be a proactive kind of an outbound reach that advisors would be given to facilitate not just the capture, to your point, of the signature or the paperwork, but that there would be some light guidance around how to start to have conversations proactively. Candidly, that didn't work. Capturing things proactively sounds great on paper, but in reality, everybody's busy. And we know that these can be difficult and time-consuming conversations to have, for which advisors oftentimes don't have time. So I think institutions could do a lot more, I'll say, on the reactive side to support advisors, but also, frankly, to help cut through some of the clutter around procrastinating.
Yeah.
And while on the topic of procrastination, I think there's an amazing piece. It is called Solving the Puzzle of Procrastination, and it's written by Tim Cycle. And the premise there is really there are 7 reasons, all of which, not surprisingly, come up in most major financial decisions that cause us to procrastinate. So as we think about successor decision-making, I would argue, can the process be boring? Can it be frustrating? Can it be difficult? Is it ambiguous? Is it unstructured? There's not necessarily an intrinsic reward for everybody. And lastly, does it have some sort of personal meaning? All of those factors have been found to drive procrastination, and I would respectfully say none of them have been incorporated into the outreach around securing signatures and facilitating conversations. So if we were going to have that process, and institutions certainly could, focusing on just getting started, chunking out the process, and giving clients and advisors something really simple to hold on to, just to get started, can break through some of that anxiety and really help to advance the conversation in a way that could happen before the crisis. And I think what we're both here to hopefully help facilitate is not having these conversations and meetings in crisis.
I think that's really well received on my end. I'll go a step further as an advisor, at the risk of stating it too strongly. Like, I do not feel like my institutions are giving me enough support, and I've had to do too much to sort of figure it out on my own about what to do in that particular situation. So the rest of the podcast, I'll tell you exactly what I'm doing to pretty good effect. But I'm sympathetic because I'm in the seat, and I lived a good part of my career in the seat where I've got new family that all they want to talk about is their new priorities and whatever the change in housing and healthcare circumstances are. And, my training says, like, I really want to talk about interest rates. I really want to talk about, the impact of the national debt on your portfolio. This is not a puzzle piece that is fitting into this new conversation that I've got. And I think institutions and advisors really need to zero in my opinion, knowing that this is a brand new framework. I think that if I was going to say, like, what's the best thing that I've prepped for this particular podcast, it's this next handful of ideas. Demographics is destiny, and this isn't going to change for either advisors or institutions. And advisors need to understand that the moment that this successor decision maker conversation starts, either you're proactively reaching out to identify these successors and come up with best practices, or reactively, and we're going to talk a lot more about that, Suzanne, or reactively, these incoming calls are the advisors need to react to in real time. I think advisors need to understand that this is a new game, that there are going to be new winners and losers in terms of institutions and the way advisors are able to maintain second generation retention. And knowing that effectively the beginning of these successor conversations is effectively a new stage that advisors are, whether they know it or not, they're competing on this stage the moment that happens. And, the chance of advisors having these conversations it's 100%. It's all of the percents. Everybody is going to have this conversation, and institutions are not doing a good enough job training us to know what to do in that moment when the conversations that they involve money, but they're never about money. They're about new competing priorities that new decision makers are trying to sort out that eventually will help define the job of the money. But they have to sort out what the roles and responsibilities are, their understanding of the new circumstance with perhaps an impaired senior investor. And advisors need significantly more training to be able to navigate those conversations about what's the new hierarchy of priorities, how do we drive consensus around housing and healthcare priorities, and then to translate your role as a professional to whatever those new priorities are going to be. Said another way, the reason that we need to do this stuff with the money is because the path that we're on involves large itemized medical expense deductions, and we need to change around the investments, the liquidity, the tax planning, and whatnot. But it is grounded in the new priorities of how do you support a senior investor that might not be as independent as they used to be.
So I want to go back to housing and healthcare and connect those to training specifically. And from your perspective, Tom, you, I know, have put together a lot of things in your practice through which and for which you've been successful in these conversations. What would help look like to you in the moment, whether that be from a training perspective or a resource perspective? Because in addition to advisors, you've got lots of, I'll say, institutional folks listening to this podcast. So this is a great opportunity to talk about support in the moment so that you don't have to put those things together.
Well, I'd like to start with that reality of procrastination. One of my gripes/inspirations is my view of human nature is most people procrastinate, and most people don't embrace holistic planning where they try to figure out all of their financial and legal and transportation and housing and socialization. Most people don't do that. And when I say most, I don't know, 75, 80% my experience. And we've got to go to that majority first. When you're talking about procrastination, one piece of advice I would give is, you're not late, Mr. or Miss Advisor, in this conversation. You're right on time because your client probably procrastinated and they don't have all their stuff in order, and the successor decision makers don't have all their stuff in order. And if you've got a matriarch or a patriarch for the first time that's less able, and the symptom that you as the advisor are reacting to is this power of attorney form or this successor trustee form or something like that, they haven't done this before either, all right? So you're all doing this for the first time together. What's extremely important, I think, is recognizing this is an opportunity for the advisor to have a shared experience with the successor decision maker of navigating and identifying new priorities in an ambiguous and sometimes highly stressful set of circumstances. and you were able to demonstrate in sort of a commitment-free tryout how you're able, through your advice that you're giving, to make true impacts on the family without having to sell anything to the second generation. You get to prove it without asking for commitment. And advisors and institutions need to understand the stage is that successor decision maker conversation. Like, that's it. And there's a 100% chance that advisors are going to have this conversation over and over and over and over again. And what we do agilely in the moment in a way that's present through the clients and the successor decision maker sort of journey and path, that's where I think that we can make a huge difference in our clients' lives and in our client retention.
So if I could go back to that notion of, let's start with power of attorney. In the spirit of, it can be really overwhelming when you sit in the client's position, and we are all a client of someone at some point. Would you start, Tom, with the power of attorney, knowing that having somebody in that role could be really, really critical in advance of a health event or a cognitive change? And more specifically, if you do start with that role, just to keep it simple, to get over the momentum, if you would, that is needed to not try to tackle everything at once, start in one place, kind of chunk it out. What are you doing to get people in the room together?
Thank you. I think that the big piece is, let's start with who am I talking to? Am I talking to my senior client, and I'm making a good faith pass at being proactive? Beyond the, who's your trustee or who's your power of attorney, and let's make sure all the documents that my custodian is making me filled out are filled out correctly. Like, beyond that, I really like asking semi-formal questions. And a semi-formal question would be, who do you think's in charge of your healthcare? Who do you think's in charge of your property and financial decisions? By asking the question that way, you get all sorts of good stuff from your client. Well, the power of attorney says my daughter, but my son's a giant pain in the butt, and he's going to come in and wreck everything unless we do X, Y, and Z. And they will tell you more often than not what the potential pain point's going to be beforehand. Who do you think's in charge? Well, it's probably my second wife. Yeah, but that's not what your documents say. Well, that's a pain point. We probably need to sort of zero in on that. So you're looking, when you're doing this for a senior client, you're looking for them to identify through this semi-formal line of questions, like, what are the real problems going to be? The reason you want to know the real problems, aside from serving your client, meeting hopefully a fiduciary standard of doing right by them, those are the problems that when you solve them with the successor decision makers, that's what keeps you hired. Like, they're telling you in advance the problem that you're going to need to navigate to put you in the best position for that second generation conservation. So that's what I do with sort of that G1 level. The second thing that I do, and my experience is most people procrastinate. And I do a good, but certainly could be better effort across my whole book of, okay, who are the successor decision makers? What do they know? Do they have the time, the ability, the expertise, the temperament, to play their role appropriately? But if I'm talking to G2 for the first time, like, I've got to get into listening mode quickly. What is it that you understand about your role right now? And then I always ask the semi-formal question, and what is it that you're really trying to accomplish? You always ask the what is it that you're really trying to accomplish, because in a period of ambiguity and stress, more often than not, they might tell you exactly the problem as an advisor that if you solve it, you're the hero. There's a conversation that I had with an adult daughter within the last 6 weeks. And she was a sole heir, and she was on all the documents and everything was right. But when I was asking her, what are you really trying to accomplish? She said, what I'm really trying to accomplish is I'm trying to get my stepmother off my back, in terms of she's worried that we're not going to support her as my dad declines, like the trust says. And she's terrified that we're going to cut her out. So she's going to be crawling all over me and hypersensitive about everything. And what she told me was, Tom, can you figure out a way that you include her in some of these conversations with me, not in a way that's going to usurp my authority, but in a way that is experienced as transparent? And Tom, can you go back and try to paraphrase what Dad's priorities were when he put these plans together so she keeps hearing them from somebody, not me? Well, how about just help me not be the bad guy? And when I asked, like, what are you really trying to accomplish? Like, that was a huge relief. And like, I've extremely high confidence that she's going to be a G2 conversion. But to come back to, what my best practices are, in summary, who am I talking to? If it's the first generation where we're proactively planning, like, always ask the question, who do you really think is in charge and how's this really going to go? And the second thing, if I'm coming to the successors directly, beyond do you understand and are you situationally aware and do you know like the health circumstance and whatnot, what is it that you're really trying to accomplish, not just in your fiduciary role, but like in your family role? Like, and they will tell you. I'm in the family role, like I'm really trying to make sure whatever it is, they're telling you the problem that if you solve it, you a lot of times can skip the selling process to conserve assets.
Yeah. You've mentioned skipping the selling process, which is spot on and done well, as you just described. Easier on the family, easier on the advisor, easier on the firm. It reminded me that you wrote for Kiplinger's on this topic, and I'm wondering, was there anything that in retrospect you wish you had talked about in that article that's just top of mind for you now?
Well, when I wrote the article for Kiplinger's, it was to a general audience. It wasn't to advisors. And, what basically I talked to, it turned out that my close on the Kiplinger's article, maybe we can put a link to it on this podcast. It had a lot to do with, listen, successor decision makers, it's hard, but there are a few rules that you need to know about how you're supposed to steward somebody else's money. And then I did sort of an attaboy, attagirl at the tail end of it. I think for advisors, the 2.0 version, the professional grade thing that I would add on to that article is, listen, don't anticipate that your clients got all this stuff right the first time when they were prepping. Suzanne, I'm going to come back to you on procrastinating. Most of the successor decision makers that I was writing the article to in Kiplinger's haven't read the document, right? So that was one of my first things. Hey, how about you read the document? That's a good way to start being a good successor decision maker. As an advisor, like, I think that sympathetically, the people you're talking to are probably doing the best they can. Like most of the time, most people do the right thing if they have the right information and support. I think that the idea of maybe being a little bit empathetic with, in their frazzle, in their procrastination, in their lack of attention, and how to work this into the bandwidth of their own complicated lives, maybe you as an advisor can have a little bit more confidence in knowing that I don't have to be a bystander. I can lend a whole lot of support in terms of helping these new decision makers, my new clients, understand their decision-making reality in a way that makes them more effective in their role.
So good. And going back to the notion of procrastinating, if one of the primary drivers is the process is ambiguous and the process is unstructured, going back to the questions that you're using to orient people, who's doing it? I would add another one, do they know? And a third one, do they understand what you are hoping to accomplish? Seems like a great jumping off point to, again, get people off the fence, start them moving towards a better conversation, and hopefully do it before there's a real crisis and give you as the advisor the latitude to pull that person or persons into the conversation. I've got one more question for you. That is this notion of blended families. So as divorce becomes more frequent, we know gray divorce is a really big thing. How are you helping your clients think through maybe older documents that have been placed, as you cited earlier, that need to change, or in cases where life circumstance changes and maybe somebody's out of the picture that was going to be that decision maker? How are you counseling clients to work through that process as families kind of come apart and maybe come back together as a blended unit?
Ooh, good question. What's coming to me is the principles that I use, because every situation is going to be different. One of the principles is, what is exactly the healthcare and the cognitive circumstance that everybody is reacting to? Like, what caused all these dominoes to start? What I'm looking for, Suzanne, is I'm looking for what is the foundation of consensus, okay? that like if you got blended families that maybe not everybody gets along, like what can we agree on first? In the same way that you can't serve, multiple masters, you also can't serve priorities that compete with one another. Like you can't do it all. So what I'm looking for is how can I help the clients arrive at, the successor decision makers, the extended family, whoever it is, arrive at the new consensus. And the first thing to be aware of is, remember, the financial advisors are rarely getting all the decision makers in the room. Like we already know there's a primary financial that plays that role and then maybe a backup, but there's this whole other group of people that can have huge impacts on the way that decisions are made for blended families, for adult children of senior investors and whatnot. And I want to remind you that when the advisors too, when you're talking about changes in healthcare and changes in housing and the support around that, everybody's in the room, okay? You have everybody that wants to have a voice is trying to get in that room, in that family. So imagine the blended family and somebody's got to move or somebody can't stay at home. And the typical cycle of priorities, Suzanne, is something like, I want to stay at home no matter what. Well, maybe that isn't going to work. What do you do now? Well, I want to stay with my spouse then no matter what. Well, if that doesn't work, what's the new priority? Well, I want to manage a respectful and dignified death. Like what you're trying to do is you try to get, as an advisor, you try to get somebody, not you, to help define the health and housing reality that everybody's living in. Because if you have, for example, the successor power of attorney not believe that mom's got dementia, you can't move the ball forward until there's consensus that like, look, she probably can't make all these decisions by herself. But what you're trying to do is you're trying to get consensus about what's the situation right now, and you try to get buy-in among everybody that can say no. In these blended families, you got a whole bunch of people that can say no, but not everybody can say yes.
Exactly.
You got to, as an advisor, who can say no to what? And what you want to do is you want to get consensus around the healthcare and the housing priorities first and get them to say yes. And then every part of your value proposition as an advisor, the way you serve, the way that you communicate, the way that you manage the portfolio, liquidity, you implement different authorizations for different accounts, you go back and you mirror back to every single person in that family what that housing or that healthcare priority is. Mirroring is an underrated skill. Like sometimes you ask what I do. Well, like I just tell the client what they just told me, and then I keep telling them again. That's basically where I do. Consensus around housing and healthcare priorities. That's the stuff that involves money, but isn't about money directly, but eventually is going to drive the money. And that's where you as the advisor can serve now and later.
Nailed that question. Thank you.
Oh, all right. Feeling good about myself. Let me mention one other thing. It's again on the procrastination side. And this has to do with supporting your successor decision makers in their want to procrastinate. It is human nature, given ambiguity. I don't know how long dad's going to live. I don't know how much care mom's going to need. Like, I don't know if I can take any more time off from work. Like, there is an enormous amount of stressful ambiguity. And normal people procrastinate as a default mental state because what's really happening is they're waiting for more information to be more sure about what to do next, right? Like that's what's causing a lot of success in decision makers to act decisively. You as an advisor can help these successor decision makers play the role of identifying the decisions that you can't push off. Start with the calendar-based ones. You got to take your RMDs. We got to figure out the new withholding. You got to make sure that you pay taxes on time, like those kinds of things. Start anchoring decisions about money that cannot be put off as you get more clarity around the housing and healthcare priorities. But I also give clients the coaching this way. Rush to make revocable decisions. Don't hold out all your options and keep them spinning. Do the best you can with the information that you've got and try to leave a back door that you can change your mind, but make that revocable decision sooner rather than later. What has been played back to me a number of different times from clients who felt like we served their parents extremely well, they'll look back on that advice of race to make a revocable decision as one of the best pieces of advice that we were able to give them, because it gave them a sense of control. It gave them something to flex into in terms of this decision support role, but it also helped them, like I've got, my parents are still alive, and I have a handful of different roles to play as the primary financial successor decision maker, but I also am playing the role of adult son. And there's always a little bit of a tension in terms of like when my parents have some challenges, what are the different roles that I really want to play? Projecting forward, I'm thinking along the lines of the faster that I can check off some boxes in my role as a successful financial or healthcare decision maker, it gets me to the place that I would aspire to be, which is to be more present as an adult son, and that the roles and responsibilities there, because I've already taken some action on these more formal roles that have more measurable and less ambiguous steps to take. That tension between family role and my successor decision role that a lot of times is sort of governed by statute, by racing to make a revocable decision as soon as possible, it settles me as a successor decision maker that might be under some stress.
Excellent. So type 1, type 2 decisions, which I think translates to the rest of life, right? If you can make a pivot out of a decision and you can expedite getting through that process, do it. And I think what you're also saying, Tom, is create kind of the emotional and mental shelf space to be there for the people that you love. Advisors can help do that and ultimately create more peace of mind and just a better fodder for good relationships and the ability to focus on what really matters in the end. And what a tremendous service that is to provide.
No, I think that's right. And I mean, just in terms of my closing thoughts to this advisor audience, I want to encourage everybody that this is not impossible. That, like, everybody that's listening can do this. Like, if you know that when these successor decision maker conversations are coming up, like, I want you to think like the curtain just went up and you're on stage, and you need to know some of your lines before the curtain goes up. This is what I say. This is where I pivot. And what you really want to drive at is, what's the consensus around the housing and healthcare circumstance? And let that be the dog that wags the tail of all the financial stuff, because that's where the family's going to take you anyway. And just remember, the successor decision makers, these are the people that are going to fire you, or these are the people that would consider hiring you after your clients pass away. So knowing that you can't prep for the when, but you can prep for the certainty of those conversations, I think can make huge impacts on not just your business, but your clients' lives as well.
And if I could pick up on that as my final thought, just do it. I think we put things off and we build them up to be much harder in life than they really are. I will share a personal anecdote, and that is my parents' advisor has never spoken to me. I can tell you that it would be a tremendous relief for me if he would do that. He hasn't, and therefore I am making other plans for them. So from the other side of the desk, so to speak, the notion of just getting started, having that difficult conversation, and the relief that it would provide from both the client's perspective and an older loved one's perspective, I think is phenomenal. And what a tremendous service that advisors can do in that moment and beyond.
I think that's right. Well, with those two great thoughts, thank you everybody for listening. We're excited on our next podcast to be going into fraud and elder financial abuse. I'm particularly excited and very animated about that conversation that we're going to be having. But for Suzanne Schmitt, this is Tom West signing off. Thanks very much, and please share this with a friend. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Family Financial Conversation podcast. The information covered in the posted represents the views and opinions of the guests and do not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Signature Estate and Investment Advisors. Disclosure: Signature Estate and Investment Advisors, LLC, is an SEC-registered investment advisor. However, such registration does not imply a certain level of skill or training, and no inference to the contrary should be made. Securities offered through Signature Estate Securities, Inc., member FINRA SIPC. Investment advisory services offered through SCIA, LLC, 2121 Avenue of the Stars, Suite 1600, Los Angeles, California, 90016. Telephone number 310-712-2323.